April 24, 1944, Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, Berlin. The mile-long hall at Ford's Willow Run breathes in shifts. A Liberator noses off its stand, jackpads drop a tug, inches it toward the daylight door. Rivet dust hangs like glitter, then disappears in the draft from 4 open cowlings. A bell marks takt, wrists and wrenches move to the same minute hand. On the ramp, a United States Army Air Forces acceptance pilot signs. The last box walks, the 32 steps around the nose. He always walks, taps the turret ring, once climbs in without ceremony. Torque callouts fade behind him. A ground chief raises 2 fingers. The engines catch in sequence, smooth and indifferent. Across the ocean, the Reich Ministry for Armaments holds its air too long. Albert Speer reads totals without lifting his eyes. Erhard Milch leans toward a map no longer matching any runway. A courier sets down a translated production sheet. Willow Run final assembly cadence acceptance flights scheduled this week. The clerk reads the line twice, 1 B-24, every 63 minutes. Pencils hesitate, then copy the number again, as if replication could dilute it. The room's routine tea gone cold ash, thick in trays, does not slow down the math. Back in Michigan, the first bomber rolls past the threshold. Brakes hiss, chalk checks vanish under glare. A crew chief slaps the fuselage where the paint is still warm. The pilot feathers each prop by field checks. The radio eases forward. No speeches, no photographs, only sequences. In the glass office above the line, the plant's general manager, Meade L. Bricker, signs the shift handover. Charles Sorensen's pacing logic is etched into the floor, sub-assemblies, feed flow, and lock into a rhythm that punishes drift. The next airframe is already on the tow bar. Aft fuselage teams close panels, while wingmen fit access plates and move on. The hour is a tool. Berlin copies a second sheet. Walter Schellenberg's people route foreign industrial notes toward the same table that tracks fuel and pilots. The language is cool and final 7 days a week, 3 shifts, synchronized sublines, acceptance and ferry integrated. The number sits there like a weight, 63 minutes, and no one argues because argument cannot move a clock. Someone underlines the month's peak, another adds a side note on spares and crews, then stops. The map does not change. On the ramp, a ferry crew in Michigan runs hands over the leading edge, feels the tiny oil on a glove, wipes signs, points to the taxiway. The Liberator lifts small in the spring haze. The tug is already hooking the next airframe's nose wheel. Inside the plant, a bell again. Men and women step to marks. Tools find fittings by memory. A second bomber kisses daylight, while the first is a dot. The cadence does not care which one is which. In Berlin, the last sentence of the report is read softly so it will not echo. In Michigan, the landing light clicks off in daylight, and the ramp looks momentarily empty like a held breath. No music. Only the hand of the clock. By the spring of 1944, the European air war was being decided by schedules as much as sorties. Germany is running short of fuel, veteran pilots, and survivable factories, yet it still clings to a deterrent story. Published workshops can recover output. Ace-led Gruppen can tear gaps in bomber streams, and American industry cannot hold. Precision on a heavy bomber at automotive tempo. Over Michigan, a different story hardens into procedure. Willow Run's long building has stopped behaving like an experiment and started behaving like a clock. Sub-assemblies arrive in sequence, inspection is braided into movement, acceptance and ferry are planned as part of the flow. When a number like 1B-24, every 63 minutes, shows up in a German digest, it is not a boast, it is a cadence. That cadence is the point of tension for the next months of the war. The wider map makes the number dangerous. In the West, the Allies are compressing Germany's airspace, dismantling its daytime freedom with long-range escorts and sustained strikes. Inside, the Reich production dispersal protects against single blows, but taxes transport, raises rework, and feeds lines with irregular pulse. The Luftwaffe still has men who can shred a formation if conditions line up, but the training pipeline cannot refill the front with pilots who have the hours to survive. If American bomber availability becomes predictable week over week, then German attrition exchanges lose bargaining power. The question stops being whether a single mission gets through and becomes whether the bomber stream can be kept on the calendar faster than losses can erase it. On the American side, the mood is not triumphant, it is tired and exact. Workers at Willow Run finish a fuselage section, hand it forward, and step to the next takt as if changing lanes. Acceptance pilots sleep on cots because the plant intends to hand them airplanes on a clock face, not a ceremony. The ferry pipeline adjusts around weather like a dispatcher routing trains. None of this makes the airplanes immortal. It makes them replaceable in a way that a staff officer can graph. When the cadence is stable enough to plan spares, plan depot time, and plan crew rotations, the whole bomber enterprise starts to feel less like heroics and more like logistics executed at scale. That feeling is the stake. It turns fear into workload. On the German side, the endurance is psychological now. Reports still arrive that show output in certain recovery lines after dispersal or after a factory goes underground. Veteran leaders still anchor units. There is still the belief that a concentrated attack at the right point can punish the enemy into slowing down his pace. That belief needs the Americans to stumble on complexity, to miss time acceptance, to fall behind on engines, or to consume maintenance hours faster than depot men can give them back. It needs delay more than it needs victory. Against that need, a figure like 63 minutes is infuriatingly simple. It says that complexity has been partitioned and timed. It says the enemy can miss a beat today and still present force tomorrow. This is why the document on Spears' table matters beyond its column of totals. If a factory can feed a timetable, then the air war's leverage moves from singular interception to sustained pressure. The Luftwaffe can still be bloody a day. It cannot bleed a calendar that is being refueled hourly. That shift distorts decisions on both sides. American planners become more willing to accept short-term losses if the replacement line is solid. Sorties that would feel reckless when aircraft are scarce become calculable risks when availability is a known function. German planners become more conservative with irreplaceable assets, nursing veterans, rationing arrangements, avoiding fights that are not ambush favorable because every loss is a wound the system cannot close. At the flight line level, this abstraction turns into muscle memory. Ground crews who once waited on parts now wait on minutes. Tools are kitted to arrive where a hand expects them. Defects loop back without drama. The point is not that a single plant can win a continent. The point is that a single plant can remove doubt from a part of the equation the other side needs to keep uncertain. When the bomber stream is fed by a repeatable hour, the man intercepting it knows he is facing not an effort, but a process. Processes do not get tired, people do. Stakes sharpen further as the invasion window approaches. The Allied plan depends on air power that is present when called and repairable when hurt. If that presence can be made to look like a timetable rather than a hope, ground commanders take bolder options: logistics chains, preload parts, and fuel with fewer buffers and training commands. Synchronize crew graduation with airframe. Acceptance. Each of those steps multiplies pressure on a Luftwaffe already struggling to generate clean, high-tempo days. The German side can still score. It cannot reset the pacing clock in Michigan. There is a human undertow to the numbers. In Michigan, the work is repetitive and exhausting. In Berlin, the reading is quiet and suffocating. One side measures success in the sameness of an hour. The other feels its remaining leverage migrate from action to argument. The line at Willow Run is not a victory parade. It is a metronome, making promises to planners who intend to keep them. Those promises are the stakes. If the hour holds, then attrition becomes a tax the United States is willing to pay because the schedule pays it back. If the hour breaks, the bomber stream becomes a rumor again, and the old deterrent stories regain weight. The number on the paper fixes the terms of the contest. Germany needs time to stretch. The hour refuses to stretch. America needs procedure to hold. The hour holds because people are forced to keep it. In that narrow gap between a schedule and a myth, the next phase of the air war is decided. The takt bell rang a brief sound like the wink of a giant clock. At Willow Run in the spring of 1944, with each stroke, a group of hands grasped. Their wrenches turned them at the right angle, tightened them to the exact force indicated on the card. The smell of preservative oil and aluminum powder, mixed with the morning humidity, clung to fingertips and imprinted itself on the edge of the panel as the workers pushed it into the row of rivets. No big stories, just numbers. How many rivet holes were complete, how many minutes remained, how many checks before the next frame was pulled to the light. Rhythm was not a speech, it was a visible schedule. At one end of the shop, the left-wing crew placed the leading edge on a rack. The support arm slid it over the thin layer of oil, wiped it clean, and marked the box with a pen that said clean, dry, and uncracked. At the other end, the tail crew closed the access panel and snapped two fingers to signal the trailer to be pulled in. Between the two ends was a constant barrage of motion, electricians bundling wires, hydraulicians clearing air bubbles, and weaponrymen testing the turret transmissions. The jump station bell rang again. Everyone was in position before the sound had died away. The complexity of a B-24 was broken down into repetitive movements, each one surviving by the timing of the next. Outside, the cold air of late April rushed in through the factory door. The fuselage had just been joined. The temporary inspection sheet was taped shut with a piece of cloth. The tow truck hooked onto the nose gear, an arm raised, a wrist turned the tow rope taut. The fuselage slid with short lunges. The brakes screeched. The long rivet grooves reflected the white light of the ceiling onto the porch. The workers stood close to the yellow paint line, making way for the metal block to pass, then immediately turned inside to pick up the next frame. The screw tray was still hot, the smell of burning rubber from the pulley when the tow truck turned around. At the edge of the taxiway was a row of bunks where the pilots were taking naps. One had just been woken up, still clutching the blanket, as if by reflex. He put on his shoes as he walked, took the checklist, and walked exactly 32 steps around the nose of the plane. His palms brushed the wing roots, feeling the roughness of the new paint. His index finger brushed the metal ribs of the turret doors. His eyes glanced quickly at the antenna, the seat belts, the emergency release latches. He muttered short, even dry sentences fuel radio trim feathering. He didn't look up at the long terminal-like ceiling because it was always the same, and the sameness was the most annoying thing. In the glass office above, a shift manager signs the handover form. The arrangement Charles Sorensen once outlined has become routine subassembly, follows a predetermined route, turns into the body, merges at the final. On the floor, the crew chief calls two workers to support a position that has just lost speed. With a few hands, the remaining minutes are back on track. They don't say urgent, they say off takt. They don't ask for effort, they ask for on time. In this language, the difficulties of a multi-ton aircraft are translated into time blocks that a shift can swallow in bite-sized chunks. On the runway on April 24-26, the landing gears of new airframes landed on the concrete in a series of even points. As soon as one pilot took off, the landing lights still flickering in the daylight, the next plane was pulled up close to the line. The radio crew stepped into the center compartment, pressed a button, heard the screech at the desired frequency, and then marked the OK box. A mechanic pulled a handkerchief from his breast pocket and wiped the thin layer of oil from the wing edge, leaving a faint gray streak. 3 signatures appeared, a sharp stroke in the corner. The ground commander raised 2 fingers. Engine number 1 fired first, then number 2, 3, 4. Each sound joining together in a tapestry as even as rain. In Berlin, the room where the translations of foreign industrial figures were laid out smelled of damp paper and cigarette ash. A line was read slowly, as if that slowness could alter the meaning of the figure 1B-24 every 63 minutes. The pen running down the column of totals stopped in the middle of the page, then continued adding an underline, then repeating the number in the left margin. No one argued about the source, because arguing cannot slow down a clock set on the other side of the Atlantic. The only thing to do was to read it again as a kind of proofreading of the truth. Back in Michigan, the time between out the door and lift off the ground was measured in familiar movements. The cabin door opened slightly, and the smell of fresh paint and warm metal wafted out. The seatbelts clicked. The throttle lever pushed up a little. The undercarriage rolled over the faded paint marks. A slight bounce as it passed over the concrete joint. The man on the ground touched his body, feeling the vibrations of the 4 cylinders working in unison. When the plane lifted off the clipboard in his hand, folded as it always did with a dry click. Only the sound of the tow truck turning to pick up the next frame remained. The other side's system was once terrifying because it relied on favorable days, on gaps in the escort formation, on each seasoned group that could break a piece of the sky. That system worked when the enemy lacked distance, time, or the strength to make up for losses. But here, right on the concrete floor full of tire tracks, that weakness was taken away. Individual failures returned to the station, hammered into rhythm, turned into an afternoon's work instead of a long-lasting hole. When the depot knew what was needed next week, when the spare parts warehouse was loaded at a precise time, when the receiving pilots were already in the factory, bad weather was just an excuse to move a slot on the calendar, not a way to Punch a hole in the whole page. There are small moments that outsiders do not notice but insiders understand as life and death. A slightly wobbly engine, RPM the mechanic's ears, immediately hear a different screech. He beckons to the person holding the torque checker. Adjusts it by half a mark. The engine sound becomes rounder. A loose string, the fingertips feel an unusual bounce. When pulled lightly, he changes the pin. Those operations do not create any legends, but they are the small balls that keep the clock from drifting. When the clock does not drift, stories about bad days lose their place to cling. The American feeling here is one of a creeping repetition. Each hour is mechanically identical, and that is what makes the numbers on the map on the other side so heavy. The German feeling is one of a dense silence after reading a line. It is not that they lack courage or technique. They lack the kind of time that is produced here in this long factory like a runway. Time produced by breaking risk into small pieces, spreading it over many hands, making local failure meaningless. The fear is not in the particular plane rolling. It is in the next one already at the door. In the same week, several consecutive time slots were held as tight as a bowstring. One crew took off, went back to do paperwork, and before they could finish telling the story of the crosswind at the taxiway, another was waiting for their signature. On the bulletin board, the little squares that said "delivered" were evenly colored. The calendar on the wall needed no exclamation mark. It needed only steady ticks. The men on the shop floor had no reason to look up. Their eyes were busy on the paint. Their hands were busy placing the right detail at the right minute. No one at Willow Run said that the clock beat made the bomb fly forever. They knew that winds could whip across them, machines could malfunction, people could tire. But they also knew that the alternate calendar absorbed those disruptions like a healthy body absorbs a cut. And on the other side, the people reading the summary knew they were dealing with an opponent who would not rest because the opponent had made time part of his machine. When the opponent used the calendar to answer for losses, the scare them into slowing down calculation no longer held true. Afternoon light slanted through the large doors, emphasizing the dust floating between the beams. Another plane approached the line. The takt bell rang. Those who had just stepped off their old positions took up new ones. A deep breath, a tight squeeze, a dry pen mark, a steady rotation. Someone's survival a few weeks later in a distant sky began with this clock. This was no accident. This was repeatable. The takt bell rang a short, sharp sound, like a finger tapping on a clock face. On the long concrete floor of Willow Run, the wrench hand dropped reflexively, a proper tightening, a dry click, and then slid to the next hole. The smell of fresh paint mixed with engine oil, pale smoke from the trailer, brake pads, aluminum powder floating in the sunbeams, slanting through the large doors. The electrician pulled the bundle of wires along the side, clamped them, wrapped them in tape. The hydraulician chased foam from the transparent tube, watched the foam run to the valve head and disappear. The weaponsmith touched 2 fingers to the turret drive ring, heard the teeth mesh as smooth as wet sand. The bell rang again, the entire moving belt sliding to the new station before the echo died away. In Berlin, the narrow conference room had a window facing a gray wall. On the table, the paper was onion skin thin. The reader reached out and flicked cigarette ash into a plate. The first line was a summary, the second a source note. The third line repeated a number. The voice slowed down as he touched the word, as if speaking slowly would convey the meaning 1B-24 every 63 minutes. The pen underlining the April column paused on that number, lifted it up, lowered it, and underlined it again. Chairs scraped. No one said impossible because impossible would not slow down the clock on the other side. Back in Michigan, the fuselage was on the support beam. The left-wing team pushed the leading edge into position. The support arm slid on the thin layer of oil, then paused for half a second. A cloth appeared, a neat wipe. The mechanic flipped the card, a tick appeared like a steady heartbeat. Under the belly of the plane, the tow line hooked to the nose gear. Arms raised, wrists rotated, the line taut the fuselage, drifted in short pitches. The landing gear screeched lightly on the concrete. The rivet line flashed white, reflected on the ceiling, and curled into the shadow of the door. 2 rows of people, like a yellow paint line, gave way, then turned immediately toward the empty jig that had just opened. At the edge of the taxiway was a row of bunks. A pilot opened his eyes as someone touched his shoulder. He sat up, grabbed his checklist, and stood up in one motion. 32 steps around the nose became a familiar path, hands running over the wingtips for roughness, eyes scanning antennas, visors, safety pins, indicators. He leaned into the cabin, turned on the radio, heard the clean clicks filtered through the static. There was no conversation, just isolated words, fuel, radio, trim, feather. Outside, a shoe hit a concrete joint with a soft click. He made a mental note, then checked the box. In the glass office, the shift manager signed the handover column. The calendar on the wall was full of dark squares. Below, a position was half a beat behind. The call was barely louder than the machine off takt. Two people slid across the narrow aisle added to that station. 3 movements, 5 tightening bolts, the electronic board jumped back into place. No one said good luck, no one patted anyone on the back. There were only minutes. On time was the only compliment. In Berlin, the appendix was placed on the table to the right. The minute-taker glanced at it, dipped his pen into the edge of the paper, and drew out a short line, 7 days a week, 3 shifts. One voice asked for the source, the other answered with the name of the collecting unit. No exclamations. No tricks. The numbers were irritatingly calm. The wall clock ticked in the silence like someone's foot being stopped. On the taxiway, the plane had reached the line. The ground crew chief raised 2 fingers. The 4 engines started up one by one, 1, then 2, 3, 4, each roaring, just right, warm and round. The fuselage vibrated very little, like a steady breath. The wheels rolled over the faded paint of the previous plane, barely noticeable, unless you looked closely. The landing lights lit up in the daylight as a good habit, then went out when the fuselage had cleared the ground by a wingspan. The mechanic folded the clipboard, the small click sound dissipated in the wind, and turned to look towards the main door. In the Berlin conference room, the glass was blurred by human steam. A hand pulled aside the curtain, and a grayer light streamed in like a low-salt dish. The words 428 in April were read aloud without emphasis. The number after the dash, 63 minutes, unit, lay there like a stone. Someone made a small line in the margin, just to mark where to return. No one argued about the division of shifts. No one mentioned the good day scenario. What they needed now was another number, not a moral statement. At Willow Run, the next plane was in the lightbox. The tail unit closed the panel, the 2 latches clicking together with a small simultaneous click. The trailer was attached to the nose gear, turning it smoothly in half a revolution. The weaponsmith pressed the button to test the turret, to the rotation, going through the entire arc as evenly as the minute hand. A small error appeared, a strange vibration at the RPM just touched. The mechanic's ears twitched, his hand, waving to the person holding the torque checker. One adjustment, the vibration stopped as if swallowed. No sigh of relief. The takt bell rang, and the group slid to the next station, leaving the plane with a new checkmark in the OK column. In Berlin, the next page contained shorter sentences, spare parts, spares ferry. Someone asked questions about manpower. Someone exhaled through the nose, absent-mindedly put a cigarette to his lips but forgot to light it. They had believed in a different rhythm. Pick the right day, concentrate, cut off a section of the flow, the other side would stop, would be confused. That rhythm required the other side to be slow in putting out the fire, to be off in compensating. The number on the paper made the calculation fail, step by step, if an hour gave birth to a new frame. A day was not a feat to be recounted. It was a calendar page to be turned. Out on the runway, the wind blew the scent of damp grass across the underbelly of the plane. Another pilot was shaken awake. He, like the last, put on his shoes as he walked, mouthing short words. He would be on the far side of the line in a week. But now, here, his job was to be part of the rhythm. The throttle was pushed up bit by bit, the engine sounding smooth as a string at the right pitch. His eyes glanced at the tachometer, the needle moving smoothly. His left hand touched the light switch, flicking it on and off as if to remind himself that it was all routine. In the glass room, the foreman looked down at the floor, where a position had just become vacant. 5 seconds later, 2 people had filled it. The minute box on the blackboard jumped another line. The whiteboard marked delivered added a green check. On the wall, the clock looked like an expressionless face from a distance. In Berlin, a question arose about the railways, about the rhythm of the movement of parts. No one spoke aloud. The pen wrote reorganization, and then stopped, because reorganization requires hours, and hours were on the other side. They did not lack courage. They lacked something that could not be called by slogans, an hour exactly like the hour before, endlessly repeated like the footsteps of the night watchman. At Willow Run, the soft screech of a turning tractor cut through the wind. The mechanic who had just wiped the wing edge wiped it again to make sure the oil was gone. He didn't look at the new plane. He looked at the opening, where the next fuselage was within reach. The ground crew chief held up 2 fingers, and the first engine started up again, the sound repeating itself without a single note missing. The briefest moment in both places is the breathless pause. In Berlin, when the number is read and the room is at a loss for what to say next. In Michigan, when the landing lights go out and the runway ahead is empty for half a second, then the next one slides in. The feeling is the same, a void filled in an instant. That void was once a place for hope to enter. Today it is a place for a different sequence. A voice from the test bay radioed in short and cold fuel. Radio, feather, accept, taxi, rotate. The words were not meant to impress, they were just doing their job. In a distant city, a man read the numbers again, also not meant to impress. He was just doing his job. The 2 ends of a string were pulled with emotionless movements, and that string, when tight enough, would pull down what had once stood on faith. On the factory ceiling, the clock's hands ticked over a line, thin and even. On Berlin's desk, the pen tip was a little dry from the lack of ink. On the runway, the shadow of the landing gear brushed against the old paint. On the door frame, the rivet dust continued to float in the sunlight. No one said miracle. No one said victory. One person made a mark, another pressed a button. The scariest thing was not the sound of the engine. The scariest thing was that the next hour had arrived. The first decision was not to do more, but to do it evenly. In Detroit and Ypsilanti Township, Charles Sorensen's idea was to force a complex product like the B-24 into the rhythm of the automobile industry, to break it down, standardize it, balance the lines, set tacks, so that every hand would meet the right part at the right minute. When Meade L. Bricker took over, the point was not to make the fast the normal, but to make the fast the normal. From then on, the hour became the true unit of production. Subassembly had to be delivered within the minute window. Finals didn't wait in line. Acceptance didn't stand in line. Ferries weren't considered post-production. The construction process is structured like a girder bridge. In each cell, components are kitted according to a test list. Tools are placed, modules are racked in the correct order, and errors are returned to the marked path. Final assembly is a one-piece line with fixed integration points, fuselage wings, wiring, hydraulics, turret, radio. A takt board is hung at eye level so that all groups are looking at the same clock. When a station lags, people are pulled over like water pouring through a slot. No one has to shout. The commander passes a glance to the dashboard, adjusts manpower, and the minute hand continues moving. In the same vein, acceptance is placed. There is no ceremonial boundary between done and handover. The inspection team stands at the edge of the floor, pushing the machine up the ramp as soon as the checklist is full. Every item is written so that the go, no-go decision becomes a system response, not an individual sentiment. Air Transport Command slots ferries by the hour, like a train dispatch station, pushing crews into takeoff windows that are quick to respond to the weather. The rear depot doesn't accept aircraft as they come. They get a weekly schedule knowing which days need engines, which days need turrets, which days need tires, and assign crew shifts accordingly. When the schedule is real, people can promise each other with time instead of slogans. The second decision point is how to filter risk into the process. Failures are defined as a clear-in, clear-out rework loop, aiming for 15-30 minutes, for small failures 1-2 hours, for complex failure groups. That doesn't eliminate risk, it makes it marginal. When the motor vibrates, torque is verified. When the electrical noise is present, the line is clamped. When the hydraulics foam is expelled to the valve. There is no waiting for advice, no waiting for special review if the failure is already on the standard treatment list. The track is therefore not a place to wait for miracles. It is where the energy of the line is converted into steady thrust. The economics of decision-making also shifted. With a wide subcontractor network, standardized components, and cross-skilled worker training, losing a frame did not mean losing capacity. The unspoken rule was straightforward: accept the calculated loss, because the schedule compensation would make it up. When statistical control looked at the delivery curve, they saw day-to-day variances being visibly suppressed, not sporadic. At the campaign level, that meant sorties could schedule more intensively, heavy maintenance could be booked in advance, and the organization could stay ahead of failures by as much as 63 minutes. On the other side of the board, structural constraints appear as knots. Distributed production helps survive the bombs, but at the cost of disrupted transportation, increased rework, and synchronization, becoming a puzzle with missing pieces. Short fuel means fewer training hours. Short training hours mean pilots arrive at the unit with a thin skill pool. Thin skill pools mean they can't unleash force at high cadences without wearing themselves out. Assets are seen as irreplaceable aces, rare frames, cutting-edge factories. Each loss is a broken circuit with no bridge. The natural incentive for management shifts to conserving assets, deferring risk, limiting experimentation, using temporary procedures instead of long-term standardization. Because standardization requires a supply rhythm they can't buy. With will, why can't the hour model be copied from the other side? Because it's not an assembly line trick, it's an organizational language. To speak it fluently, you need a vocabulary deep enough spare parts, a dense enough transportation network, uniform enough measuring tools, checklists, simple enough for beginners to read and follow, and a culture where on time is a reward and off takt is a system error corrected reflexively. Without these, any attempt to speed up will turn into chaos, causing bottlenecks and a decline in trust. A typical day at the height of April shows how this structure handles incidents. 0900. A substation is half a beat behind because the wire clamp is not engaging. The line boss sends 2 people from the neighboring cell, locking the takt for 10 minutes. 1020. Acceptance detects strange vibrations in the engine. RPM rework back to the hydraulic station. Torque-checked foam is expelled. 1045. The machine returns to the ramp. 1100. The ferry dispatcher moves the takeoff slot 30 minutes. The depot updates the next day's parts receipt to compensate for the shift. On the whiteboard, the delivered items are still full. There is no magic, just a system that treats time as real material, distributing it like bolts. At the command level, SOPs flow back into everyday language. Acceptance plus ferry is a production step, not a handover ceremony. Rework cycles are short, no defects in the line. Major defects have clear shortcuts. Spares and depots are scheduled by hourly slots, not by event. Report cadence by hour and day, no waiting for a milestone to write a bulletin. When the leader says hour, everyone in the department understands the same thing, just as when a worker hears a takt bell. From manpower to material, everything supports a strategic decision, turning losses into a side effect. When week-to-week availability is predictable, flight commanders choose missions with hope rather than prayer. When pilots know there are alternate slots to fall back on if things go wrong, the unit mentality shifts from absolute economy to limited efficiency. When depots know the schedule, they pre-position men, tools, and disassembly plans, turning heavy maintenance into a shift rather than a separate operation. Therein lies a human decision, teaching them that time is the only enemy to be pampered and the rest is procedure. At the same time, the Germans looked at their own briefs and searched for ways to slow down the clock without the tools. They could hide the factories but not the lack of fuel. They could move the assembly lines underground but not move the aces into cloning biology. They could change the bombing schedule but not the thickness of the spare parts network. The difference was not in will, but in the elasticity of the organization when pulled by the same unit of measure minutes. When a side speaks in terms of process, the answer is always speed, and when speed is repeated long enough, it becomes policy. At that point, every map, every maneuver, every sophisticated attack must answer the same dry question: does the calendar still hold? The answer in Michigan is a clock on the wall. The answer in Berlin is a number line. When process becomes speed, speed becomes policy. The myth was simple: the heavy bomber was too complex to keep pace with the car. Just break the alternate rhythm, gaps would open, and the bomb stream would thin out, then slow down. The myth lived on the hope that the enemy would stumble somewhere subtle, somewhere in some inspection, somewhere in some supply line. In the spring of 1944, the myth ran into something denser than steel time. One morning after a light rain, the large door of the factory slid open the edge of the floor, drying as quickly as a sheet of paper under a fan. The previous B-24 had just lifted off the ground, the next one was already in the bright spot. The tail crew pressed 2 panel pins, the click sounding in unison. The electrician installed a final clamp. The hydraulician chased the last foam thread like a bright thread in a clear tube. The takt bell rang. The entire range slid to a new station, like a river changing course without leaving a vortex. At the ramp, the pilot who had just been called up walked exactly 32 steps around the nose, ran his finger over the rough paint edge, turned on the radio, heard a thick enough set sound, and made a mark. A small error flashed in the engine RPM. The torque checker came in after 3 hand movements half a turn. The vibration stopped like swallowing. No praise, no shouts, only the bell. The failure does not create gaps. A few minutes ago there was a row of green lights. A few minutes later there was still a row of green lights. When the error is broken down and put into a short rework cycle, it cannot eat away at the whole day. It becomes a morning affair. What remains on the taxiway is an unfriendly regularity. Engines 1, 2, 3, 4. Picking up the fuselage vibrates softly. The landing lights come on in the middle of the day, as a good habit, and then go off. The wheels roll over. The faded paint of the previous one, hard to see unless you bend down. One plane leaving the ground is a dry line of pen. The next one in position is a normal breath. Mythology needs a long puncture. Rhythm answers only in minutes. In Berlin, the conference room froze as a number repeated itself. The summary page was placed under the fountain pen, the line April running across like a small horizon, and right next to it, the number that slowed the reader's voice, 1B, 24, every 63 minutes. There was no discussion because discussion cannot slow down the clock in Michigan. There was a request to verify the source, an underline, 7 days, week 3, shifts a note, acceptance plus integrated ferry. Everything else was official silence. The operating belief changed its flavor from hoping for good days to noting regular calendar. An officer put his hand on the edge of the table as if to stop the paper from sliding. In fact, he was blocking the feeling that he had lost some invisible anchor. From then on, behavior changed with a new inertia. Thick days were avoided. High-risk reputation-driven sorties were trimmed. Aces were conserved as capital. Rare frames were hidden. Each decision to take to the skies had to answer the old question with a new word hour. Places of opportunity, a jerky line, a clogged depot, a week without a crew, were now blurred by the calendar. Off-beat shots no longer paid off because the beat was a wide band, not a thin thread. At Willow Run, language translates directly into habit. Off-takt means pulling a person. Short-circle rework means pushing the error to the right door. Accept, taxi, rotate means 3 mental movements that require no explanation. When a process becomes a reflex, speed is no longer a phenomenon. It is a trait. A shift ends. A row of ticks is added to the whiteboard. The duty board is changed. The folding bed is occupied. If there is emotion, it is in the half-second gap on the ramp when the landing lights have just gone out and the previous plane's undercarriage has not yet dissipated. That gap used to be where myths entered. Now it is where the next one is. There was no shortage of short sentences that followed. We no longer negotiate with their time. You can't slow down a clock that's already in production. The people who read those sentences weren't bitter. They were just tired. What they had believed, that a complex product naturally resisted pacing, had been defeated by a simple idea: break risk down into minutes, put risk on a calendar, and answer every punch with the next iteration. From that moment on, the opponent was no longer an airplane. The opponent was a calendar. 3 days later, the Willow Run handover board added a new row of ticks without changing the font. The hours continued to fill. Acceptance and ferry overlapped like 2 perfectly fitted gears. On the ramp, the folding beds were still occupied, called up by slot, walked exactly 32 steps, signed, started the engine, rolled, and stored. The fear did not disappear. It was broken down into hour-to-hour tasks, replacing a hydraulic assembly, checking an electrical connection, rotating the crew, telling the depot to update spares for the next day. At ETO, the question at briefing became less: will there be enough planes, and more: will it be on time? Over the next week, sortie density increased by schedule, rather than inspiration. Daily command sheets became checklists, slogans faded into hours. Depot received weekly schedules divided into shifts based on specific needs: turrets, Wednesday engines, Friday tires, Sunday. Statistical control reported daily readiness, curves deviations narrowed, drop points stabilized. At Flightline, the half-second gap after landing lights went out was filled by the nose reader sliding into the line. The continuity was quiet, but it eroded doubt better than any speech. On the other side, the change in behavior was slower but more obvious. Thick days were systematically avoided. Sorties were only kept when the ambush advantage was credible enough. Aces were withdrawn from unnecessary risk. Rare frames were hidden. Resources were focused on areas where face was important. Briefings shifted from hunting opportunities to avoiding schedules. The phrase, breaking the rhythm, became less common because rhythm was no longer a thin thread to be broken, but a wide band difficult to cut. Propaganda changed the tone, emphasizing endurance and preservation rather than breaking. By the end of the month, the biggest change is the work ethic. For the US, tension turns into routine, anxiety becomes precautionary, inventory fatigue becomes shifts, breakdowns become predictable rework. For Germany, power becomes a burden. Each frame, each veteran is a rare commodity to be preserved, allowing boldness to erode. Meetings in Berlin are less argumentative, more underlining, less exclamation. Closing shifts in Michigan are less cheery, more tick marks, less watching eyes. The question remains for the viewer: if this 63-minute rhythm had stabilized half a year earlier, would the illusion of aerial deterrence have collapsed before the Ardennes? And when the enemy is prepared to pay more in weeks than in days, what does a better heavy mean, other than being more expensive to lose? Next, look to the sky, where the ground calendar clings to the escort calendar, when the long range locks the bombing route and the procedure of the land. Ours climbs into the wings. What remains for the enemy is not a beautiful air battle, but the space between two clock ticks. Here, fear is just work. As for schedule, it is still law.